All right, so today we are in Are You Covenanted part 54. All right, yay. Okay. And we're going to be heading into chapter 7 of the book of Hebrews. Now, just a reminder, this is really important as we go into chapter 7. So what has been going on here that I'm not going to go through the full review of what we've covered, but just the important piece here is that we're dealing with the difference, or in other words, the comparison between two priesthoods. This is the key focus now as we get into chapter 7. Now, starting at the beginning of the book, we've been talking about the fact that the context here is that during the siege of Jerusalem, around that time, this book would have been written, that there was a real serious concern that life as they knew it was going to change, because it was, but they weren't sure how that was going to work. In other words, everything revolved around the temple and the priesthood of the Levitical priesthood that was in the temple and those kind of functions. And now what were they going to do without that? And so an argument, a case is being made for Yeshua's place in the big picture of their lives and their lives individually as a community, the Hebrews. And remember, this is people that were understanding him as Messiah. They were getting a large part of him, but they weren't understanding the fullness of the relationship in terms of his priesthood now that he's sitting in the heavenly temple as the high priest. Okay? So we're starting to compare not only two priesthoods, the Levitical and the Melchizedekian, because Yeshua would not qualify as a Levitical, but we're also going to be comparing the two temples, the one here in the physical and the one in the heavenlies. And that's going to be the focus going from chapter 7, 8, 9, like that, okay? So just recognize that what we're comparing here are those things. It's not comparing Old Testament to New Testament or a different covenant to a different covenant. This is talking about the relationship to the people of two priesthoods and how they function in two different spaces. One is in the heavenly temple and one is here in a physical temple, which is about to go bye-bye, right? They were about to be, lose the temple and lose that whole battle with the Romans. All right, now. And so as we go forward, keep that in mind. That's really important. We've already listed and listened to a lot of the argument and case we made for Yeshua's qualifications as high priest. That was a big part of chapters 5 and 6. And actually even earlier than that, as we go forward through this chapters, now we're going to get to chapter 7. The whole point of this was to get us eventually to verse 22 of chapter 7, where it was talking about this idea of a better covenant, okay? And so we're going to also deal with the idea in verse chapter 8. Well, we might not get to chapter 8. Well, let's just deal with chapter 7. Hopefully we might get to chapter 8. All right. So beginning here in chapter 7, let's start. He says, well, actually, at the end of chapter 6, he reintroduces Yeshua as Melchizedek. He says, where Yeshua has entered as a forerunner for us, having become high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so this is, now where has he entered? He entered into something in the heavenlies. He didn't enter into something here, okay? So he's in this heavenly temple. Verse 1 of chapter 7. For this Melchizedek, or Melchizedek, sovereign of Shalom, priest of the Most High Elohim, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the sovereigns and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, his name being translated indeed first, sovereign of righteousness, and then also sovereign of shalom, that is sovereign of peace. So if you remember in Genesis, this is a reference to Genesis 14, verses 16 through 20. We're not going to turn there, 18 through 20. But just so you can mark it down, this refers again back to Genesis 14, where Abraham met with Melchizedek. And they broke bread and they had wine and he gave a tithe. Now bear in mind that Melchizedek is really a conjunctive word. It's Malki, which has to do with being the king, and Tzaddik, or righteous. So he translates here as sovereign or king of righteousness, good translation, but also sovereign of peace, because that was the role of the Melchizedek. Okay? We also know that one of the names of Yeshua is Sar Shalom, or Prince of Peace. Okay? And we also know that he's coming as what? King of Kings, Master of Masters. It says, now let's understand, this is where we're going to get to some of the stuff that we need to unravel. It shouldn't be too tough. He says, so he's called the sovereign of righteousness and also the sovereign of shalom, that is sovereign of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but having been made like the Son of Elohim, remains a priest for all time. So let's talk about this. This refers to the position first and foremost. Now remember, not all things are going to be just one thing. So this section, first and foremost, is letting you know that we're dealing with a non-genealogy-based priesthood. Because a lot of arguments have been made, and I went to churches that said that this is talking about Yeshua because, after all, this person didn't have genealogy. Well, Yeshua has genealogy. He's like the firstborn or the first brought forth of a father. And he has a father. He has genealogy. The position is not genealogically based. That's the important thing here. Because the Levitical priesthood, the Kohanim, was very specifically genealogical based. Now, it wasn't just you had to be a Levite. You had to be literally a son of the Levite line known as Aaron's line. Okay, so you had to be out of the Aaronic line. But this priesthood is not genealogy restricted. You could be from any genealogical line and still be in the Melchizedekian priesthood. Okay? So here we're being told that it's not genealogy-based, nor time-based. In other words, there always was and always will be a Melchizedekian priest. And so it's not a time-based. It's without father or mother, without beginning of days nor end of life. In other words, this is a role, a position that will always existed and will always exist. Are we following that in the simple Peshat? Now, of course, if you hadn't had the context all the way through here, that we were dealing with a battle between, or not so much a battle, but a comparison of two different priesthoods, you would miss the simple point here. If you weren't understanding that, hey, well, I'm trying to make a case for Yeshua being a priest, and the people I'm talking to are thinking, but he's not a Levite. And I have to say, yes, I get that, because the priesthood he's part of doesn't require a genealogical lineage. Okay, that's all that's happening here, very simplistically. Now, of course, it's then linking it directly to Yeshua when it talks about having been made like the son of Elohim, remains a priest for all time. Now we're linking this specifically to the end of chapter 6 when it talked about Yeshua as the Melchizedekian priest. Okay? But notice that it never says he was Melchizedek. It says he was a Melchizedekian priest according to the order. He was a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. The order has no genealogy. The order is not time-bound. The position exists. Hopefully that unravels our first little issue for the day. Okay, let's continue in verse 4. So verse 3 was saying there is also a type and shadow issue going on here, pointing ultimate manifestation in Yeshua. Because now he is going to be the high priest forever. There will never be anybody else needing to be that high priest. He's that high priest. Okay? Do you understand he wasn't in that position prior? He'd been lots of things. He was the Word made flesh, everything else. It's only now that he's sitting as high priest. Okay? Verse 4, now see how great this one was, to whom even the ancestor Abraham gave a tenth of the choicest booty. So bear in mind here in verse 4, the high, almost extremely high level of reverence that the community of the Hebrews would have had for Abraham. We should have that kind of high esteem as well, but that's where they're saying, look, this one was so impressive, Abraham respected him to give him the tithe. And truly those who are of the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a command to receive tithes from the people, according to the Torah, that is, from their brothers, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. So now, we're getting this comparison. Melchizedekian priests received tithes from Abraham. Now we know about the Levites receiving tithes from their brothers. We're comparing the two. We're also told that the Levitical priesthood comes genealogically down through Abraham, connecting them together. He says, however, verse 6, right? However, the one whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham, and blessed the one who held the promises. So now he's trying to say it is appropriate, because remember, going forward, he's making a case now going forward that you can do now to the Melchizedekians like you were doing to the Levites. Because after all, that was being done even before there were Levites. Are we following that simplicity there? Because remember, they're having to transfer their thought process, their heart, their reliance, their trust, their dependency on a priesthood that's about to disappear and transfer all of that onto the one that will remain forever. And he has to make a case that it's actually not breaking any laws, because remember, they're very law-based, right? They're Torah-based, covenanted people. It's not breaking any laws, and it's actually appropriate to give these things that you were giving to the Levites now to the Melchizedekians once there's no Levites. He's making that case. He says, however, the one whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed the one who held the promises. And it is beyond all dispute that the lesser is blessed by the better. And so now he's saying the Melchizedekian was higher than Abraham because the Melchizedekian priest blessed Abraham. Okay? And so he's saying, look, this is a higher level. So if the Melchizedekian priest is blessing Abraham, and it was out of Abraham's loins that eventually comes Levi, he's saying the Melchizedekian is higher. It is a superior place. But in respect to Yahweh's decisions and plans, it did not have a high position or even functioned in any high position while the Levitical was there. There was a change in the law, so to speak. In other words, a behavioral change that while the Levites were functioning, all that went to the Levites. The Melchizedekians did not receive those things. Okay? But he's saying now we're going to have to revert back to the original model because the Levitical one's about to go. So it's beyond dispute that the lesser is blessed by the better. And here it is men who die that receive tithes, but there it is someone of whom it is witnessed that he lives. So now we're seeing, but you're giving now to a leadership or a ministry that exists always. So he's trying to help make this transfer in their mind. This is hard. He's got to make a mind switch. All right? So the Aaronic and Melchizedekian priesthoods are going to be compared and contrasted here, and it will be explained here why the Melchizedekian is greater or better, or even just think of it maybe simply as preeminent. Okay? So greater or superior on some ways and preeminent. It preexisted the Levitical. Okay, because that is important for them because literally, remember, they're freaking out about the loss of the anchor of their life. Their lives are revolving around and anchored around the Levitical priesthood and the temple. Okay. Verse 9, and one might say that though through Abraham, even Levi who received tithes gave tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So you have this again showing that think of the hierarchy of this. The people gave their tithes to the Levites. The Levites gave a tithe to the Kohanim. Through Abraham, the Kohanim actually gave their tithes to the Melchizedek, if you think of it that way. The Melchizedek priesthood. Now, so you see how that kind of hierarchy, this is the argument that this person is making a case. It's not just a letter of comfort. He's making an argument, a case for where Yeshua and that priesthood belongs in their lives. Continuing. So it goes now to verse 11. Truly then, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people were given the Torah, why was there still need for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? That's the question. Okay, well, if everything was supposed to be perfect and done just with Levitical, why was there need for another? So he's going to explain. He says, for the priesthood being changed of necessity, there takes place a change of the law also. In other words, there was a time when they gave the tithes and offerings to Melchizedek. Then they were told to give them to the Levitical. Now they're being told that you can go back and give them to the Melchizedek. These are adjustments by necessity. Not necessity saying, my boss says he'll fire me, so I have to work on Shabbat. That's not a necessity. That's not the same thing. Okay? Here we're talking about a can't. You won't be able to do anything with Levitical when there's no priesthood and there's no temple. Okay? And so a necessity also was that because they became a nation, and as a cohesive nation together in the land, they needed a body, a tribe to literally be their priesthood, rather than these individuals that were the Melchizedek priesthood. which was done through a process known as discipleship. Okay, the priesthood was passed down through elders and discipling. But then we get to, so that's where you have Moses, the 70 elders, etc. Noah did that with Abraham. Shem was doing that also. Shem was actually likely the one that was the Melchizedek that Abraham gave the tithes to. Shem was the high priest. So just so that we understand what's going on here, okay, is that there's not a change like Yahweh changed and the law has changed in that way. These are necessary adjustments because of functionality, because of the situation. They were individuals up to a point. Then they became a whole nation. Remember that this is that incredible miracle. What other God is it that ever took a nation out of a nation? That's one of the verses. A nation was taken out of a nation. Well, the nation needed more than just a few guys, like 70 guys helping, etc. They were going to need a priesthood. And the Levites, a whole tribe, was going to do this. But now we're about to lose that whole function. So let's understand what we're talking about here. Notice that it says, for the priesthood being changed. Now, when it says of necessity to take place a change of the law, let's be very simplistic, very pashat, literal. What changed? Priesthood. So what part of the law needed to change? Only the part that had to do with priesthood. Christianity would say, see, the law gets changed and done. No, this is all about 1,000,000%. Nothing else has been discussed here about except priesthood. The only issue at hand here is priesthood. And the only case is for the transference from Levitical to Melchizedek. So this doesn't affect Sabbath keeping, kashrut, eating foods, feast days. It doesn't affect anything in your Torah except the temple priesthood related stuff. And so yes, there was a necessity to change because after all, what are you going to do when there's no more? That's their whole panic. What do I do? There's not going to be a temple anymore. There's not going to be a priesthood. What are we going to do? This isn't their first battle with Rome, by the way. Okay? They've had others within the less than 100 years. It was 2 actually prior to this, around that. So I mean, they've got experience knowing we're in big trouble now. They've really decided they're going to come in here and wipe us down. Wipe us out, scatter us, whatever they're going to do. They can see the writing on the wall, all right? So for the priesthood being changed, that's the issue of necessity. There also becomes changes in how things are done. By law, we're talking about statutes, ordinances. In other words, who do you give the tithe to? Not whether or not you tithe. You see what I'm saying? There's adjustments to how things are done. Okay? Not whether they're done, but how they're done. Okay? That hopefully is clear. Verse 13. For he of whom this is said belongs to another tribe from which no one had attended at the altar. So he's specifically talking about looking now at Yeshua as high priest. That's the change that we're dealing with here. A Kohanim change to a Melchizedek high priest change. Okay? Let's make sure we are clear here. Because what? He belongs to another tribe for which no one had attended the altar. Who gets to attend the altar? Only the Levitical. You don't get to do this if you're from another tribe. What tribe was Yeshua from? Judah. Okay? Verse 14. For it is perfectly clear that our master arose from Yehudah, a tribe about which Moses never spoke of concerning the priesthood. Never, never, never spoke. Okay, that's a whole different thing. All right. It's perfectly clear. When you read this the first 1,000,000 times over your years as a Christian, was it perfectly clear? No. Because it would be if you had the right context, right? If you had read Hebrews in the simplistic context of what's going on, you would get it. But you also had to have an understanding of the Levitical priesthood, the Kohanim, the high priests, and everything else from the temple service from the Old Testament, from the Tanakh. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. Okay. He says, it's perfectly clear that our master arose from Judah, a tribe about which Moses never spoke of concerning priesthood. Again, what is the point going on here in Hebrews chapter 7? It's all about priesthood right now. They called him Melchizedek. He's the high priest in the heavenly temple. And now they're trying to understand how this is going to work with him not being a Levite. And this is clearer still, in case it wasn't clear enough the first time, if another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become not according to the Torah of fleshly command, but according to the power of an endless life, for he does witness, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So now he's going back to that hierarchical thing, saying the Melchizedek priesthood is higher, superior, preeminent. So he's not saying that the fleshly one was bad and awful in this. It just wasn't as great as this one. This one is more fully developed. It's stronger. It's the higher manifestation of what it's supposed to look like. Okay? But of course, the Christian side of it's going to make it, take it as an attack on the fleshly Levite priests. Well, you're fleshly, right? Aren't we still fleshly? You can grab and pinch yourself. I mean, you're still here. Yeshua is no longer in the flesh. Yeshua is sitting in the heavenlies. So he's got his position according to the power of an endless life. For he does witness, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. By the way, this is a quote from Psalm 110, verse 4, just in case you're wondering where that's coming from. For there is indeed a setting aside of the former command because of its weakness and unprofitableness, for the Torah perfected nothing but the bringing in of a better expectation through which we draw near to Elohim. Oh, brother. So what's that? Okay. The Torah did not perfect anything, though itself was perfect. Let's understand. It didn't perfect anything. Was anybody that ever walked Torah perfect? Were they made perfect because of it? No. Only one being has ever walked this earth that was perfect, and he did walk the Torah perfectly. The Torah is not the fault. It's the fleshly person trying to walk it. But he's trying to say that, look, the Torah, just because you kept Torah, the Torah didn't perfect anything. Okay, the Torah doesn't, that's not what it's there to do. It's to teach you how to develop a right way to love him, your creator, and to love each other, and to develop the integrity to make the adjustments when you fall short. That's a Deuteronomy 8:2 test, right? That he's testing us to humble us to see whether it's in our heart to keep his commandments or not. So he's saying here that the Torah didn't perfect anything, though in itself it was perfect. It itself was perfect. What it did do was bring in a better expectation through drawing near to Elohim. Follow that here, okay? For the Torah perfected nothing but the bringing in. What it did was it brought in a better expectation. Before you had Torah, what kind of expectation did you have? Death, nothing. But now, because of Torah, you have a better expectation, a better future potential, you see? Through which we draw near to Elohim. So the purpose of Torah was to do what? Help you develop this expectation so that you would draw nearer to Elohim. We're good so far? We're following this. He said, now bear in mind that in verse 18 it said, there is indeed a setting aside of the former because of its weakness and profitableness. Look, it couldn't stop the Romans. It couldn't perfect the Israelites, which is why Rome was allowed to come in the first place. Because had Israel done what they were supposed to do, they would have been protected always. Okay? So it's not that the law was weak or unprofitable. We're going to see later it's because the people were weak and didn't profit from it. They failed in it. Remember, the promises said, if you keep this covenant, obey everything that comes out of my mouth, you will never be in fear. No one will ever molest you. Nobody will ever harm you. You won't have to worry about other nations coming in and destroying or doing. You will be protected. So why didn't it profit? Because of the weakness and unprofitableness of it towards people that were weak. If you're weak, it's of no use. I can teach you. And you know what? I'm going to use definitely a specific example. I teach people in counseling all the time things that will help them improve their lives. And when I do that, I always tell them the same thing. I'll give them 2 or 3 techniques, and I can guarantee the techniques work, but only if you do them, right? Now, if you don't do them, those techniques would have proven to be unprofitable because of your weakness. You see how that's just like the law? I give people things to do. Any of you can do the same thing. If you're teaching your child or if you're happen to be counseling, you give somebody something to do that you know works. But if they don't do it, it won't work. So I want you to understand, it's the people here that are the problem. Now, because the Torah perfected nothing in weak people, unless they would submit to it and then become stronger people. Now, and it was not without an oath, for they indeed became priests without an oath, but he became priest with an oath by him who said to him, Yahweh is sworn and shall not regret, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So this verse 21 reminds us who we're talking about. So who were weak and unprofitable, etc. with Torah? The priesthood. And we know the priesthood, by the time we get to Yeshua, are the bought and paid for cronies of Rome. These are not, as a matter of fact, they're not even the appropriate Aaronic ones. We've got some problems with the priesthood being from the wrong line. They're Levites, but they're not Aaronic. And so here, he reminds us we're still talking about priests. We're not talking about everybody. And we're not talking about a problem with the law. He said, indeed, they became priests without an oath. In other words, Yahweh didn't say, you're a priest forever. He said, I'm going to choose the Levites from among them. They will be my priests. And they will be, as generationally, that tribe will provide priests forever. But he didn't say you individually, because you are weak and you are flesh. When he says, he says, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. He's talking about an individual now. He's talking about Yeshua. Because he's perfect. He says, for they indeed became priests without an oath, but he, with an oath, by him who said to him, Yahweh has sworn and shall not regret, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. By as much as this Yeshua has become a guarantor of a better covenant. Okay, now we're going to get into this. He's become the guarantor of a better covenant. Now, I'm not going to have time, and I'm not going to take the time, and I apologize, to go into every Greek word and explain to you what the Greek word means from that point on. I'm just going to tell you, in my research, this is a better translation of the Greek word. Okay, the Greek for better here is more accurately translated as better because it is more fully developed. Well, that's a whole different idea. Not better because the other one was bad or awful or this or wrong or useless. No, it is more fully developed or stronger or with a sense of being nobler or reaching the needed dominion or level of mastery. So it's the next level. It's not that was bad, throw it away, it was a curse, you couldn't do it anyway, blah, blah, blah. He's now the guarantor of a better, more nobler, higher level of mastery, reaching this other level of dominion, this better, more fully developed covenant. Wow. Now that's a whole different thing than you're hearing on Sunday. Because after all, he's the guarantor of a better covenant, which means the other one wasn't good. No, this one is just more fully developed. It means that it's built upon. Wasn't there a Noahic covenant or an Adamic covenant or an Abrahamic covenant? Was there anything wrong with those covenants? No, but each one had to become more fully developed. It was stronger, not weaker. And then when you get to the Mosaic covenant, it's much more fully and detailed out in its development. And now we're building on that to the next level, which makes this a better covenant. It doesn't disrespect the previous. There's never a disrespect for the Noahic, the Mosaic, or the Abrahamic, then the Mosaic. Never in each one does it say, well, that Noah one was terrible and stupid. We're going to have now the Mosaic one. Okay? So why does Christianity do this to the Mosaic one? Because they don't want to keep the law. So they disrespect the law. I'll say it again. The Greek word here for better is it's not, look, if you speak any other language, you know you can't just go word for word, language for language. Sometimes it takes a sentence to say what that word means in one language in the other language. So this word translated as better is actually better translated, okay, as the way I described it as being better because it's more fully developed. Better because it's stronger, nobler. It's reached a needed dominion level. Now that you've reached this level, you can go on to the next level, is what it's saying. The next level, by the way, okay, if you're in a building, if you're on the first floor, can you go to the second floor by getting rid of the first floor? Can you build the second floor on nothing? It's built on the first floor. Okay? That's what it's saying. It's like you've reached the level of mastery here. You're now ready for the next level. Wow, that's some cool stuff. And we've been building up to this now for a couple of weeks because this is a great understanding of what a better covenant is. He says, now you Hebrews who believe in Messiah, with the temple being destroyed, you are now ready in their level of mastery to go to the next level, which is built upon all the previous levels. I hate to use a martial arts example, okay? But when I got to be a black belt, well, before that, when I first started off as a white belt and I got to be a yellow belt, guess what I was expected? To know everything that a white belt knew, but I was ready to learn the yellow belt stuff. When I was ready to go to green belt, I wasn't expected to look at the yellow belt stuff as dumb and wasteful. No, it was foundational, and I had to master it so I could handle the green belt stuff. Now, a lot of you out there are freaking out thinking martial arts is all pagan and everything else. Well, you can calm that all down. I'm just making a point. Don't miss the point. See, all that blue emotional stuff, calm down, don't miss the point. Okay? The point is that it took a level of mastery for me to now be able to learn the next stuff built on what I had mastered. Or I would not be able to master the new stuff. But in mastering it, I didn't throw away and discard the old stuff because it was foundational to the new stuff. Now we starting to get it? So in order to be ready for this higher level of covenant, this better, by being more fully developed, this higher level of mastery, you need to have mastered the other. What's the other? The whole Mosaic thing. Amen. Don't think you're going to go into the Yeshua thing if you haven't mastered the Mosaic thing. By mastered it, it doesn't mean now that you mastered it, you throw it away, you don't need it anymore. No, now you've got it down so well, you do it just like breathing. That's what mastery is. You now do it without thinking. It's part of who you are, okay? This is what we're talking about. So he's saying here, look, by as much, remember, this is the one who he swore an oath, and he said, you are a priest forever, by as much as this Yeshua has become the guarantor. This one who had the oath, this one who is of the Melchizedekian, he's become the guarantor of a better, more fully developed, needing a higher level of mastery, stronger covenant. And indeed, those that became priests were many because they were prevented by death from continuing, but he, because he remains forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. In other words, they had to have a lot of priests because they kept dying off and they needed more, and they would die off and they would need more because they were flesh. He says, but we have one high priest. Remember, we were talking about priesthood here. There was a rotation. Remember that? The high priest had a rotation. And depending on the order they were in, they served for so many weeks, and then they had the next. They took turns because, after all, that burden was tough on a fleshly person to have one job, one person. And what if something happened to the one person? Somebody else could step in. He's saying, hey, look, those that became priests were many. They needed a lot because they were prevented by death from continuing. They weren't going to live forever. But he, because he remains forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Wow. This is now we're getting more of a comparison between Levitical and Yeshua as Melchizedekian high priest. Therefore, remember how much we love those therefores. Based on all the things we just said, therefore he is also able to save completely those who draw near to Elohim through him, ever living to make intercession for them. 24/7, 365, blah, blah, blah. The fleshly priesthood couldn't do that. Okay? So that's a more fully developed, higher level of covenant with a higher level guarantor. Or I should say, mediator. Because really the better idea is, and we're going to talk later, is the idea of him being a mediator. Okay? Now, where was I? 26. For it is fitting that we should have such a high priest, So now again, we're only talking about priesthood, specifically high priest. All through this stuff, starting the whole chapter 7 is all about high priest, whether it's Levitical or Melchizedek. He says, it's fitting that we should have such a high priest, kind, innocent, undefiled, having been separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens, who does not need, as those high priests, to offer up slaughter offerings day by day, first for his own sins and then for those of the people. For this he did once for all, that when he offered up himself. So he doesn't have to do the same. He doesn't need a temple, a fleshly one like we had down here, to do these kind of offerings. For the Torah appoints as high priests men who have weakness. Let's go back to when it talks about weakness in verse 18. Because of weakness and unprofitableness, now he's talking about it, he explains himself in verse 28. The Torah appoints high priests men who have weakness. So the problem was the men, not the Torah. But the word of the oath, which came after the Torah, appoints the Son having been perfected forever. Now, this is also translated badly, verse 28. I'm going to give you my translation of that. I'm going to read that whole sentence. Follow along in your book, but listen to me read it. For the Torah appoints as high priests men who have weakness, and the word of the oath behind the Torah appoints a time, age for the Son to accomplish or complete it. That's actually what it says in the Greek, in a much better translation. So when it says the Son having been perfected forever, it misses the point. It really has to do with a time or an age to accomplish or complete. Because that's the process we're in. We're in a process of it being accomplished and completed. The Torah appoints as high priests men who have weakness, and the word of the oath behind the Torah. See, that's another thing is here it says came after. No, the Greek actually has a better idea of it being the support of the behind, the developmental piece. The reason behind the Torah behind the oath. The oath behind the Torah. What happened? Abraham was given an oath. Then we find other places where there are promises or an oath. The Torah is a manifestation built on that oath. The oath was also to Yeshua being a high priest forever. We read that in Psalm 110. Okay? So we're seeing how this is all layered. The oath is superior. It predates, it's a predecessor to the giving of the Mosaic commands. And by the way, Deuteronomy, we're told, don't think you guys are so awesome. You get to be where you are because of a promise or an oath made to Abraham. So the oath underlies why we got all the things that we got, why he wanted to give us the covenant, why he wanted to give us the law, because it was part of fulfilling an oath. Okay? For the Torah appoints as high priests men who have weakness, and the word of the oath behind the Torah appoints a time or an age, because that's what the idea of an olam, a time or a period of time or an age for the Son to accomplish and complete it. Wow. That's not what it says in most of your translations. I know it. I'm sorry. Okay? That tripped me up for many a year because I didn't go and read the Greek and figure out in the context what this was talking about. Let me say it again. The Torah appoints, I put a comma there. There's no punctuation in Greek, but this way we can get the phrasing. Okay? The Torah appoints as high priests men who have weakness, comma, and the word of the oath behind the Torah, comma, appoints a time or an age for the Son to accomplish and complete it. That is so awesome. Changes everything. Okay. And by the way, that also, by saying it the way I just read it to you, means that it has not yet been completed or accomplished. For all those who want to say it's done, it's finished, and blah, 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 blah. Because that includes all the things that he now as high priest is still doing. But when it reads it this other way, it talks about the Son having been perfected forever, like somehow it's the Son being perfected. No, it's giving him a time to finish and accomplish and complete something. The Greek really doesn't have as good a, I don't know why the word for the perfect is there. It's really not a real good word translation for the Greek there. Okay? So it really has the idea of accomplishing or completing something. Okay? Good. Wow. Now you ready for, now we should go to chapter 8. Now the summary of what we are saying. Interesting that the person who wrote this realized he needed to recap, because he threw so much at them up to this point. He says, the summary of what we are saying is, we have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the greatness in the heavens, and who serves in the set-apart place. This is the heavenly Mishkan, the heavenly temple, and of the true tent which Yahweh set up, and not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and slaughters, so it was also necessary for this one to have somewhat to offer. So hopefully we're starting to understand. So this is a summary of Yeshua as high priest in the heavenly temple, the first 5 verses here. For if indeed he were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the Torah, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly, as Moshe was warned when he was about to make the tent. For he said, see that you make all according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. So the writer here is saying that Moses wasn't just shown a pattern like in writing, that he actually got to see a vision of what the heavenly temple looked like. Not that he physically got to be taken there, but he got to see this is what it looks like. But remember, he said, look, we're comparing in this whole book of Hebrews that all this thing that they're panicking about is not to be diminished, not to be offended or assaulted or whatever, or to minimize, but he's saying, look, what we're dealing with is a copy and a shadow. It's still important. It's still to be respected, but it's only, to put him in the right perspective, a copy and a shadow. Yeshua is sitting in the real one, as the high priest in the real one. We were dealing with, and they were dealing with, the copy and a shadow. What do you do with the copy? You practice. Okay? What do we do with the feasts every year? We're practicing. Can we really do it exactly according to Torah? No, we need a temple. We need a priesthood. We need to be in Jerusalem, more or less. Okay? I mean, there are things. So we are practicing because we are not in the real. Okay? As a matter of fact, this life isn't really life. It's practicing. We're in the copy and the shadow of real life. This is still just a shadow of things to come, right? He says, okay, so we serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly. Now the key word there is serve. They're still to serve it. And he's talking only about the priesthood still again. We serve that copy, as Moshe was warned. He says that there was a greater one, the one seen on the mountain. But now he, Yeshua, has obtained a more excellent service as a priest in that temple, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which was constituted on better promises. So Yeshua obtained a different, in other words, this implies a more superior service than the Levitical priesthood in verse 6. Okay? And it's also talking about Yeshua being the mediator or go-between of a more fully developed or stronger covenant on the basis of a more fully developed and stronger promise. And that's where the word better actually gets translated, okay? So he's saying, look, you guys are now ready in your level of mastery to deal with this mediator of this more fully developed covenant and more fully developed promises. Now, it's not that the promise is not the same promise, but we're getting our understanding of it is now being more fully developed so we can appreciate what was going on. Like when Abraham was told, you are going to be the father of many goyim, many Gentiles, many nations. Do you think he had any idea what that really meant? Probably not. But over time, we see that understanding become more fully developed. Not that the promise gets changed at all, but what's getting developed is our understanding of it. So we're getting a much more fully developed understanding of the whole plan of everything, and now we're ready in our level of mastery through all of the teaching and the training for the 4,000 years up to this point when this writer is writing to say, hey, now we're ready for our high priest to sit in the heavenlies and bring us to this more fully developed, stronger understanding of covenant and of the promise. Wow, okay? Very important. So Yeshua is now the mediator, the go-between. Remember, the high priest was like a mediator or go-between. Yeshua is now in that role. This is still comparing high priest roles. Okay, the Kohanim, the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, did this. Yeshua is Kohen HaGadol, so to speak, of the Melchizedekian. He's the high priest. This is how he does it. Okay? So they want to, the person who's writing is wanting to say, you lose nothing. You had this before, you have this now, it's just more fully developed. It's just more complete. It's just the level of mastery is ready to take us to another level of how we would do this. Okay? By the way, this is happening not the minute after Yeshua was resurrected. Nowhere in this letter does the guy say, what's wrong with you, you idiots? When Yeshua died and was resurrected, we weren't supposed to need a temple anymore. Where's that verse? We weren't supposed to need to do sacrifices. Sacrifices were done away with. What's wrong with you? What are you, thick-headed? No, these people are being given instruction only now when there will not be a temple. By necessity now there's a change. And then they're saying, now you're ready to learn about your high priest in the heavens. Now you're ready to learn what the shadow was pointing to. Now you're ready for the next step in your developing your understanding, not altering and changing law. Hopefully that makes some sense. Okay? Where did I leave off? Verse 6 we read. Okay, now, let's understand verse 7. For if that first had been faultless, and a lot of your translation says covenant, that's not anywhere in the Greek. That's an inserted word. So we don't know what to put there necessarily. It says, for if that first had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second for finding fault with them. Now we know what we need to put in the blank. For if the first, priesthood, ministry, whatever, the first priesthood had been faultless. Because he said finding fault with them, not with it, not with the law, not with the covenant, not with the promise, not with the system. So be careful. If you've got an italicized word, don't just assume it's right. It's probably got the highest level, not always, but it's got a higher level of being mistranslated than the non-italicized because it's a word that the Greek doesn't even have or the Hebrew doesn't have. It's a missing word that somebody's filling in as a language translation because the word in the Greek or the Hebrew might imply something, but it doesn't overtly say it, so they're filling in a blank. So when you see in my translation it says, for if that first, and the word covenant is italicized, I can tell you when I went to look at the Greek, it's not there. For that first had been faultless. And so what are we talking about, the first versus the second? So we're talking about the first temple, man-made stuff, the first priesthood, the shadow, the copy. If it had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he says, see the days are coming. Says Yahweh now this is going to be direct quotes out of Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. He says, see, the days are coming, says Yahweh, when I shall conclude with the house of Israel and the house of Judah a renewed covenant. In other words, I shall bring and put into place a new covenant. I shall make, consummate, bring together. Now, this word conclude is poorly translated there. Because you look at Jeremiah 31 and 31, it says, I shall renew a covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers, in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Mitzrayim, because they did not continue in my covenant, and I disregarded them, says Yahweh, because this is the covenant that I shall make with the house of Israel after those days. This is pretty much a good straightforward quote from 31 through 34. He says, this is the covenant that I shall make with the house of Israel after those days. Notice it's no longer house of Israel and house of Judah, because at that point, the two sticks of Ezekiel 37 have come together. Okay, they're now coming together. They're one house, not two. The kingdom is being restored under one that's called Israel. Everybody's calling themselves an Israelite, not a Jew, not a whether a Reubenite or an Ephraimite or a Menashite or Zebulun. No, Israel. Okay, there's no two kingdoms. We're all Israel now. He said, I'm going to make, after those days, says Yahweh, giving my laws in their mind, and I shall write them on their hearts, and I shall be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. He's not talking here at all, in any way, shape, or form, can you even remotely conclude he's talking about anything different than the Torah. Jeremiah 31:31 is not talking about all of a sudden getting a new, different set of laws. He's talking about the laws that they failed to keep. And so this is a direct quote out of Jeremiah. This is not some New Testament, New Covenant, new whatever, New Age thing. He said, I'm going to have it be so it's in their mind and it's going to be on their heart, so they're going to do it like breathing. They're going to do it because it's a part of them. I'm going to cause them through experience and through trials and tribulations to make choices to break their self-sovereign, stiff-necked positions, their hard-hearted positions, and cause them to choose to submit. And submission is the biggest problem in Scripture everywhere. He says, and I shall write them on their hearts, what? These laws, giving my laws. What laws? The laws of the Torah. And they shall be my people. I shall be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. And they shall by no means teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know Yahweh, because they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. Because I shall forgive their unrighteousness and their sins and their lawlessness, I shall no longer remember. Now, bear in mind, he's quoting something that has not yet happened at this point. This is after Yeshua by a good number of years being resurrected. Okay, this is about 40 years later. And so for anybody who says that somehow, Yeshua brought in and ushered in and it was the fulfillment of Jeremiah 31, we still haven't had it be to the point where nobody will have to tell his brother or his neighbor, know Yahweh, because they'll all know him. Does everybody you know Yahweh? Sometimes I wonder if anybody I know knows Yahweh. Because remember, knowing is relational. Oh, informationally, a lot of people think they know him. But relationally, he's saying, look, no one is going to have to teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, have a relationship, have that relationship properly with Yahweh, because they all shall have a relationship with me. From the least of them to the greatest of them. By saying renewed, he has made the first old. Now what becomes old and growing aged is near disappearing. So what is he saying? He's saying, look, there needs to be a renewing. Israel broke the old one. We still have some fragments of the observances of it being done. Torah is being kept. There is a temple. He said, but that thing is near disappearing. Not the Torah. The people keeping it and the temple that was a part of it. Because everything up to this point has been about priesthood and temple. It's not about all the other 600 and whatever laws, okay? Although a lot of them are priesthood and temple related. Okay, so the other 500 or so laws, all right? It's not talking about that. See, but Christianity wants to insert whatever they want to insert in their way of filtering through this stuff. Everything we've talked about since chapter 1 is about one specific aspect of law, which is the temple and priesthood, if you want to put them together. So you can say two, the temple and the priesthood, which really is combined into one thing. That is the only issue here in Hebrews. And you've heard me on other teachings say over and over again, if you don't understand context, you'll never understand the book of Hebrews right. Now, hopefully you see why. Okay? Because you can't possibly understand this thing correctly if you don't have the right context. Let's make sure we're not forgetting that everything consistently, without exception, from chapter 1 till now has been about Levitical priesthood, Melchizedekian priesthood, Kohanim of the Levites, and high priest Yeshua of the Melchizedek. The temple in the shadow of the copy that we have here, and the temple in heaven. That's all this has been about. It's not been about kashrut. I don't know how you eat. It's not been about holy days. It's not been about Sabbath keeping. It's not been about honoring mother and father or murder or stealing or adultery. It's not been about any other piece of the law. The only thing at issue here is temple and priesthood. And what he's saying is there hasn't been a doing away with. There's a transference to the higher, better one that always was there. That's different than what the Christianity would say, well, that's done away with. We don't need it. It's old. It's wrong. It's bad. No, we're still doing all the same things. We just don't have the physical sacrificial system going on without a temple. But we still have a high priest. We still make tithes and offerings. We're told that we could bring it to the Melchizedekian priests. Because remember, there was a fleshly one that met with Abraham, and he gave his tithe. And that goes to all you people out there online. Oh, there's a lot of you that want to buy into because you really don't like to give your money to anybody. You want to be, I told you, tithing is going to either expose a finance problem or a selfishness problem. Okay? And so here is an argument made, and we read that in verse 6 of chapter 7, that there was tithes that were given through Abraham to Melchizedek. I mean, the Levitical tithes were given to Melchizedek. And so, yes, it's appropriate to go find yourself a Melchizedekian priest person and give them your tithes. Because people will say, well, we're only supposed to give it to the Levites. Well, you didn't understand the book of Hebrews at all, did you? You didn't understand Genesis, did you? Okay. How much time we got? Good. All right, so back now here. So we're getting now into chapter 9, which I have no notes for, but we're just going to rock forward here. So do we understand? Well, you know me. I always like to have notes. No, I don't. Okay, so let's understand that this is trying to tie together in chapter 8 the Jeremiah 31 mentioning and describing of this new covenant thing, a renewing of covenant, and applying it in part to what's going on. This is part of that process of renewal, the fact that there was going to be a change in priesthood. That we were now going to be ready in our level of mastery to go up to the next level. Not our level of mastery to reject the previous levels, but now to build upon. Of course, if you're still struggling on the milk, which was also talked about here in Hebrews, you're still on the first floor or still with the white belt or whatever you want to use as your metaphor, struggling learning how to, make a fist properly and hold your hands right as opposed to actually blocking anything. And that's the point. Because if you didn't learn how to properly hold your body or make a fist or block something, when somebody comes to hit you, you won't be able to do it. That's the metaphor from that physical thing. A lot of our children are now in our MTOI Academy, our brand new school, and a lot of them are taking math. You know what you need to know in math? A lot of them are taking like algebra now and advanced, more advanced mathematics, and some of them are struggling with some of the aspects at times. I'm not picking on our students. None of them told me this. I'm guessing that this might be happening, okay? So other students, I don't want them to get mad saying I exposed something. But you know what? If your basic math was a struggle, and you didn't build a strong enough foundation in your basic, especially order of operations, those kind of things, you're not going to be able to do the more advanced because you didn't master the basic. How are you going to do this more advanced if you still are wanting to reject or struggling with the basic? That's the point. That's why I'm glad we got to redefine verse 22 as being stronger, more fully developed, and needing a higher level of mastery to now go into. But the mastery is of the previous. You have to master the old before you go to the new. I was a sensei. I had a school. This is 1987. It's a long time ago. But my students, we didn't test them on a schedule. We tested them when I looked at them and I said, you're ready. When I felt they had mastered the stuff. If I didn't, they had to wait. They'd be upset because their friends were moving up. I said, fine, then spend the time and master it. This is not like school. This whole life of Torah observance in the context of Messiah is not like school. We're not going for a passing grade of a C and thinking I'm going to get in. We're going for A's and mastery. Our school is teaching to mastery. I'm not, to all you students in the academy, I don't care what your grades are initially. I want you to keep doing it till you perfect it. You must master your stuff. School systems in the public school system don't do this. They just want you to get grades. And you could actually take courses on how to get a better grade and still not learn anything. I took a class on how to pass my French Regents exam. Regents exam is a New York State thing. Okay, so it's like a mastery test to see if you've mastered a subject that you take as a senior in high school. And I was lousy at the class because I had lousy teachers to start with and had a lousy foundation. But I was able to take a course that taught me how to pass the test to the point where they thought I cheated on the test because I got such a great grade on the test Because I said, no, I took a course on how to pass the test. Because all people cared about was the grade. So there are people out there that will teach you how to get the grade and still not know anything. I knew zero more French after I took the course, but I knew how to pass the test and get a passing grade. That's the system we live in. You need to master the covenantal obligation of doing what he says. You need to master how to walk in the fruit of the Ruach. You need to master how to keep the Torah commandments so that it becomes, like he said, I'm going to write it in their minds and on their hearts. In other words, it becomes like a thoughtless meaning you don't have to think. It happens automatically, okay? I'm sure that was something that was taught if you were in the military. It was taught in the martial arts. You want to get to the point where you can do without thinking. It's an automatic response, because if you have to think, you're dead. It's too late. And if you're thinking when it comes to Torah observance, it's the same thing. The more you think, the more you are getting involved, because you're thinking. Okay? And as soon as you get involved, you're in trouble. Because then you start to rational lie to yourself, because you got yourself involved in the mix. But if you've gotten yourself so disciplined and trained, there's no thinking. Okay, someone goes to put something in front of you shouldn't have, there's no thought. You don't do it. Your boss says, I need you to work on Saturday, there's no thought. You're not doing it. But as soon as you start thinking, you start to rational lie to yourself and justify and excuse or whatever. We need to get to the place where this is on autopilot. In other words, you've learned it, you've studied it. Look, do you really think a whole lot? Think about all of you that have been driving for 15, 20, 30 years. Sometimes you get home, you don't even remember driving. But you remember, if you can go back far enough, can you remember when you first got in the car and you're like looking at the mirrors, and looking at this, where's the gas, where's the brake? But now you do all of that without thinking, because you realize in an emergency, if someone cut you off, you would have gotten killed if you had to think about hitting the brake. But your foot hit it before you, almost as soon as you even had the possible thought. You reacted, okay? But I don't want you to be fully reactive without any kind of thought. What you're doing is you're proactively creating that habit. Proactively developing the reactive response so that it's not requiring your emotional or intellectual involvement. Hey, I need you to come in on Saturday. I appreciate that, but I can't do it. There's not a thought of trying to figure out how to make it work or how to spin it. See, that's when you are thinking. Go back to the teaching, what are you thinking? I had to mention the teaching in there somewhere, so. Okay? Is this starting to make sense? Okay, now I know we covered a lot. We're going to get into chapter 9. 9 goes into a large description about some of the differences, again, with the priesthoods and functions and that kind of stuff. And we will get, hopefully, into that here next time. I'm looking at the clock, perfect timing to finish. So we're just going to go ahead and wrap it up with prayer. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Father, we're going to really need to take the time to allow everything we learned today to sink in. Help us to patiently listen to this more than once. Read your word as it really reads, as opposed to the way we've been taught to read it. Understand the simplicity, the Peshat understanding of these things. And understand that we have to come to the level of mastery before we even have the audacity to think we're ready for the better, the more fully developed, the stronger promises and covenant that Yeshua brings. So, Father, help us to have humility. Help us to get off the throne and let you sit. Help us to submit to everything you're showing us, so that if truly, Father, we can have you write these things on our minds and in our minds and on our hearts, so that we truly can be your people and you can truly be our Elohim. So we can truly know you, have a relationship with you. Father, we are so appreciative that we have such a high priest. We're so appreciative that we have a high priest who's a high priest forever in the true and the heavenly temple, not the copy in the shadow. We're so appreciative that we have such a mediator, a go-between on our behalf. Help us to be in line with all that. Help us to be worthy of all that. Help us to truly embrace and appreciate all of what that means in our lives. Father, we just are humbled by this. We're overwhelmed with the relationship that you that you open up and allow us to have an opportunity to be a part of. And so, Father, we want to thank you. We want to praise you and want to give you all glory and all honor in the name above all names, Yeshua, our high priest and our Messiah. Amen. Amen. Amen.